The Nadir was a ghost in the void, a solitary hum against the infinite, indifferent black. For cycles, he had been my only companion, her polished decks and humming conduits of familiar skin around my solitude. My name is Cole, and my quest was an impossible one, to hear the universe speak in a tongue utterly unlike our own, a language of true otherness. My console, a mosaic of flickering data, was the canvas of my obsession. Each distant signal, each faint resonance, was a breadcrumb leading deeper into the uncharted, where the known cosmos frayed at its edges. Today, however, promised only the mundane. A derelict moon, designated Whisper 12, hung before the viewport, a bruised and ancient orb. Its surface was a testament to eons of celestial indifference, a barren canvas of dust and fractured rock. My current task, a routine mineralogical survey, a monotonous grind of sensor readings and atmospheric pressure checks. I donned my environmental suit, the familiar click of the seals a small comfort against the vast emptiness beyond. The airlock hissed, exhaling a puff of recycled oxygen, and then I stepped onto the regolith. My boots crunched, a sound swallowed instantly by the vacuum. My scanner, usually a chirping companion, remained quiet, reporting only the expected: silicate, basalt, trace elements of iron and nickel. Nothing to excite the Xenolinguist, only the geologist. Hours bled into one another, a steady rhythm of data collection, my mind drifting, yearning for the anomaly that never arrived. Then, a flicker on my wrist-mounted display. My steps quickened, the heavy suit suddenly feeling less cumbersome, more like a second skin. I traversed a jagged ridge, my breath fogging the inside of my visor, and descended into a narrow gorge, its walls steep and unforgiving. There, nestled amidst a scatter of impact debris, it rested. It wasn't large, perhaps a meter across, but it held the eye with an impossible gravity. It was not truly a cube, nor a sphere, nor any shape I could readily define with terrestrial geometry. Angles shifted subtly, defying the very logic my eyes were trained to understand. The material itself was a matte, obsidian-like substance, absorbing the harsh lunar light without reflection, yet somehow appearing to hum with a faint, internal luminescence that wasn't light, but something else entirely. It was a visual paradox, a thing that existed, yet seemed to contradict the very act of existing. My scanner, now held aloft, began to behave erratically. The numbers on its display danced, flickering through sequences that made no sense: ambient data, temperature, pressure, magnetic flux, being absorbed, then regurgitated in patterns that were mathematically sound but utterly meaningless. A strange, almost imperceptible resonance began to vibrate through the regolith beneath my boots, a low thrum that bypassed my ears and went straight to the bone. It was not sound, but a tactile sensation, a silent song that seemed to hum from the artifact itself. I knelt, my gloved hand hovering inches from its surface. My mind, usually a fortress of logical analysis, felt a subtle, almost imperceptible tug, as if an unseen current was attempting to redirect the flow of my thoughts. It was intriguing, yes, but also deeply unsettling. This was no geological curiosity. The artifact wasn't emitting, it was receiving, a silent maw devouring the ambient data of the cosmos and reshaping it into something incomprehensible. The low, bone-deep thrum intensified, a melody without notes, a rhythm without beat, and I felt a strange, unsettling echo deep within my own skull. It was a call, I realized, not for my attention, but for something far more intimate. The Nadir hummed a low, expectant note as I piloted her claw arm, a precise, articulated limb, towards the derelict moon's scarred surface. My breath was a ghost in the recycled air, each exhalation a cloud of anticipation. The artifact, a silent, obsidian geometry, waited, nestled in the dust of ages. It was heavier than it appeared, its facets absorbing the faint starlight, refusing to reflect. A tremor, not of the ship but of something deeper, ran through me as the claw's magnetic clamps engaged. Bringing it aboard was a delicate ballet of grab lifts and shielded conduits. I guided it through the airlock, its passage marked by the faint groan of stressed metal, then into the main research chamber. The chamber, usually a sterile symphony of blinking lights and data streams, seemed to recoil from its presence. I placed the object on the central analysis plinth, its polished surface a dark mirror to my own reflection, warped and elongated. It was smaller than my torso, larger than my head, and every curve, every edge, seemed to defy the simple rules of geometry I'd known my entire life. Its angles felt wrong, not sharp or obtuse, but something else entirely, as if space itself folded inward around its form. Initial scans, Nadir, I murmured, my voice a dry rasp against the sudden, profound silence. The console glowed to life, a spider web of holographic projections blooming around the artifact. I set the parameters, spectral analysis, mass density, ambient energy readings. My fingers danced across the interface, accustomed to the intricate ballet of data acquisition. The results were immediate and baffling. The spectral analyzer, designed to dissect light into its fundamental components, flickered erratically, displaying impossible hues, colors that existed beyond the visible spectrum, bleeding into non-existence. Mass density readings fluctuated wildly, suggesting an object that was simultaneously immense and weightless. The ambient energy sensors simply flatlined, then spiked with readings that defied known physics, showing negative energy signatures that then morphed into an infinite loop. It was as if the artifact was not merely absorbing data, but eating it, chewing it up and spitting out fragments of pure, unadulterated nonsense. A strange sensation began to prickle at the edges of my awareness. It wasn't a sound, not exactly, but a pressure in my inner ear, like the slow descent of a deep-sea submersible. The air, usually crisp and ozone-tinged, took on a faint, coppery taste, metallic and ancient, like blood dried on stone. I blinked, rubbing my temples. My vision seemed to shimmer at the periphery, the sharp lines of the console blurring into soft focus, then snapping back with a painful clarity. Nadir, rerun diagnostics on all external sensors, I commanded, my voice betraying a hint of strain. Cross-reference with internal environmentals. Confirm no atmospheric anomalies. The ship's AI, ever diligent, responded with a calm, synthesized confirmation, all systems nominal, Cole. Environmental integrity at 99.99%. No discernible external influences. Yet, the taste persisted. The pressure in my ears intensified, a low thrum that vibrated deep within my skull. I stared at the artifact, its surface now seeming to undulate, a slow, viscous ripple that I knew, intellectually, couldn't be real. Cognitive dissonance, a subtle crack in the edifice of my understanding, began to spread. The data was impossible, my senses were betraying me, and the ship, my most trusted companion, insisted everything was fine. I leaned closer to the plinth, my determination eclipsing the rising unease. I needed to understand. This wasn't just a discovery, it was a challenge to the very fabric of reality. As I focused, my gaze locked onto a particular facet of the artifact, its surface seemed to deepen, to draw me in. Suddenly, I was elsewhere. The scent of pine needles, wet earth, and something primal, like raw stone, filled my nostrils. My boots crunched on loose scree. I stood on a narrow ledge, the wind tearing at my clothes, whipping strands of hair across my face. Below, a dizzying drop into a valley choked with ancient, gnarled trees. Above, jagged, snow-capped peaks clawed at a bruised, gray sky, their summits disappearing into swirling mist. This was a mountain pass, vast and unforgiving, a place of stark, untamed beauty. A memory? A dream? I could almost taste the fear, the exhilaration of the climb. Then, with a jarring snap, the illusion shattered. I was back in the sterile confines of the research chamber, my hand gripping the cold metal of the plinth, knuckles white. The coppery taste was stronger now, a metallic tang on my tongue. My breath hitched. That wasn't a memory. I'd never been to a place like that. Not in the flesh. It was too real, too immediate. My quest for contact, for true alien understanding, had perhaps found its answer. But at what cost? My own sanity already felt like a thin sheet of ice, cracking under an unseen weight. The metallic tang lingered, a coppery film coating my tongue long after I'd retreated from the artifact's immediate vicinity. I scrubbed at my teeth, then ran a hand over my ears, as if to dislodge the resonant thrum that had taken root deep within my cochlea. The vessel's familiar hum, usually a comforting lullaby of distant machinery, now seemed to carry an undercurrent, a low, almost imperceptible vibrato that wasn't part of its systems. I told myself it was phantom sensation, the body reacting to prolonged focus, to the sheer strangeness of the object. My mind, a fortress of logic and empirical observation, demanded a rational explanation. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of observation logs and system checks, all punctuated by the artifact's silent, unblinking presence in the main bay. Always, there were patterns. Not obvious shapes, but an unsettling recurrence of angles, of lines that didn't quite meet as they should, or converged in ways that defied perspective. I'd blink, rub my eyes, and they would dissolve, leaving only the mundane. Stress, I concluded. My isolation, the weight of the mission, the sheer novelty of my discovery, it was all culminating in visual fatigue, in my brain trying to find order where there was only chaos. Sleep offered no reprieve. The first dream came like a sudden drop into icy water. I stood on a narrow ledge, the air biting and thin, the sky above a bruised purple. This was a mountain pass, unlike any I had ever seen, carved from rock that shimmered with an unnatural, obsidian sheen. The sheer cliffs on either side clawed upwards, not in linear ascents, but in impossible, recursive twists. A peak, meant to rise to a sharp point, would instead fold back upon itself, a geological Mobius strip defying gravity in form. My breath plumed in the frigid air, each inhalation a painful rasp. The ground beneath my worn boots was loose scree, each pebble a tiny drum against the vast silence. Yet, it wasn't truly silent. A low, persistent vibration resonated through the rock, up into my bones, mirroring the thrum I'd felt awake. It was the mountain pass singing. And its song was not of wind or creaking ice, but of a geometry that tore at the edges of my comprehension. I tried to move, to navigate the treacherous path. But the paths themselves were cruel illusions. A winding trail I swore led forward would, with a turn of my head, reveal itself to be spiraling inward, ending abruptly against a solid wall of the same twisting rock. The distant horizon, where one might expect to see a glimmer of sun or stars, was a seamless, featureless gray, a canvas for impossible, shifting constellations that were not stars at all, but pinpricks of light arranged in patterns that made my vision swim. Every angle, every shadowed crevice in the rock face, seemed to hold a fleeting, familiar echo of the artifact's silent contours. It was as if the mountain pass itself had been birthed from its alien logic. I reached out, my fingers scraping against the rough, cold stone, and felt not solid rock, but a vibrating membrane, a living surface that hummed back at my touch. Panic began to claw at my throat. I couldn't scream, the thin air pressed it back down. The mountain pass was a trap, a labyrinth of impossible design. I jolted upright in my bunk, heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, the metallic taste acrid in my mouth. I swung my legs over the side of the bunk, burying my face in my hands. It was just a dream. The deep space isolation, the pressure of my mission, the artifact's unique properties stirring something subconscious. My mind was processing, generating narratives from unfamiliar stimuli. It was normal. Yet, the clarity of it lingered, not fading like typical nightmares. The impossibly twisted peaks, the recursive paths, the sky of non-linear light, they felt stamped onto the back of my eyelids. I spent the next hour reviewing vessel diagnostics, checking for any anomalies, any subtle power fluctuations that might explain a sensory hallucination. Nothing. But the dreams returned. Each night, the mountain pass grew more defined, more terrifying. I started to notice the subliminal patterns, not just in the dream, but waking, too. A shadow cast on a bulkhead would momentarily resolve into an impossible angle. The pixelated static on a monitor would coalesce into a fleeting tessellation that mirrored the dream's bizarre geometry. I'd blink, and it would be gone. My determination, once a solid anchor, began to fray. I meticulously documented these experiences, striving for scientific detachment, for a clinical analysis of my own unraveling. But the lines blurred. Was I observing a psychological phenomenon, or was I being observed? The artifact, silent and inert in the main bay, was not merely a discovery. It was a presence, and its incomprehensible song was no longer just a thrum in my ears. It was a new, unsettling rhythm resonating directly with the very architecture of my thoughts. Physical weight, but with an inexplicable inertia, as if it were rooted in a different dimension. Even tethered to the grav lifts, it seemed to pull against the fabric of space, its dark mass a stubborn anchor. Finally, it rested in the main lab, a silent, imposing guest. The ship's interior lights seemed to dim in its presence, swallowed by its profound, hungry darkness. Nadir, initiate full-spectrum analysis. Start with non-invasive scans. I watched, a knot of anticipation and unease tightening in my gut, as the ship's probes extended, bathing the monolith in a cascade of sensor light. The results were immediate and baffling. Readings are inconsistent, Nadir reported, its voice now tinged with a subtle, almost imperceptible hesitation. Spectral analysis shows no discernible elemental composition. Gravimetric sensors indicate localized mass fluctuations. Energy absorption continues, at an increasing rate. Mass fluctuations? I leaned closer to the monitor, my brow furrowed. Explain. The artifact's perceived mass appears to shift, momentarily increasing or decreasing, then returning to baseline. The fluctuations are irregular, non-rhythmic. It defies known physics, Cole. I ran a hand through my hair, a nervous habit. It's absorbing ambient data, Nadir. Maybe it's processing it, or converting it. What about the patterns? Any coherent data streams? Negative. They absorbed the Nadir's familiar hum, usually a comforting pulse beneath my feet, felt thin, stretched taut, as if a separate, deeper frequency had begun to assert itself. It was the artifact's resonant thrum, a vibration that had not left me since I first encountered it, now a phantom limb of sound that twitched behind my eardrums. I retreated to my analysis station, seeking the solace of cold, hard data, the structured logic of science that had always been my anchor. My hands, steady despite the internal tremor, moved across the console. I called up the primary sensor feeds, the remote probes I deployed near the artifact's resting place. The screen flickered to life, a constellation of numbers and graphs. I wanted to quantify the thrum, to locate its source, to understand its waveform. But what greeted me was not the clean, predictable lines of a gravitational anomaly or a peculiar energy signature. Instead, the readings were a fractured mosaic. The gravimetric sensors, usually precise to picometers, danced with wild fluctuations, showing negative mass in one quadrant, then an impossible density in another, all within the same microsecond. My energy detectors, calibrated to isolate exotic particle emissions, registered a chaotic symphony of non-existent wavelengths, then sudden, absolute silence, as if the very concept of energy had momentarily ceased to apply. I rubbed my temples, a knot tightening behind my eyes. This wasn't noise, it was a deliberate, impossible dissonance. I cycled through the diagnostic protocols, reran calibrations, even performed a full system purge, but the results only grew more bewildering. The atmospheric pressure gauges, pointing to the vacuum of the derelict moon, sporadically reported pressures equivalent to Earth's deep ocean trenches, then moments later, the thin, breathless air of a high-altitude peak. My internal chronometer, linked to the galactic time standard, skipped forward by entire millennia in a blink, then rewound, not to the correct present, but to some arbitrary point in a past that felt utterly alien. My voice felt alien, too, as if someone else had spoken. This wasn't a malfunction. This was the artifact. Its influence, a subtle, creeping tide, was not merely distorting the readings, it was rewriting the underlying physics, dismantling the very axioms upon which my understanding of the universe was built. My instruments, once extensions of my will to comprehend, had become broken mirrors, reflecting back a reality I could not recognize. A sudden, sharp lurch. The Nadir didn't move, yet I felt a profound shift, a displacement. The polished metal of my console seemed to ripple, liquefy, and for a terrifying, elongated moment, the familiar confines of my research vessel vanished. I stood, not in the sterile, illuminated chamber, but on a narrow ledge of jagged granite. Below me, a sheer drop plunged into a mist-shrouded chasm, its depths unseen. Above, colossal peaks, their shoulders draped in perpetual snow, clawed at a sky the color of bruised plums. This was a mountain pass, utterly real, utterly here, pressing against my senses with an undeniable presence. My breath hitched, a gasp lost to the roaring wind. My hands, instinctively, reached for something solid, anything to ground me, but found only the frigid, rough-hewn stone. A dizziness seized me, a vertigo far beyond the simple fear of heights. I knew this pass, a memory perhaps, from a childhood journey, but it was not merely a memory now, it was a physical sensation, a terrifying presence. Then, as abruptly as it had arrived, the vision receded. The granite dissolved back into the familiar gleam of the console. The biting wind became the vessel's filtered air. The scent of pine vanished, replaced by the faint metallic tang that now seemed to perpetually cling to the Nadir's interior. I gripped the edge of the console, knuckles white, heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My breath came in ragged gulps. Everything. I forced myself to look at the screens again. The temperature sensors, which had previously shown the vacuums near absolute zero, now flickered between a balmy tropical warmth and the searing heat of a supernova's core. The vessel's structural integrity readings, always a stable green, pulsed erratically, showing catastrophic breaches and immediate repairs, all within the same impossible second. It wasn't just noise, not just distortion. It was a contradictory truth, simultaneously existing and annihilating itself, a paradox made manifest. My understanding of reality, once a sturdy edifice of observable laws and predictable outcomes, began to crack, shedding flakes of certainty. The ground beneath my logical feet was dissolving. The artifact wasn't communicating, it was rewriting. It was not merely influencing my instruments, it was eroding the very bedrock of scientific inquiry. And the mountain pass, that sudden, visceral hallucination, was a terrifying premonition of how deeply its tendrils had already begun to worm their way into the most private sanctuary of all, my own mind. What if the Nadir wasn't even here anymore? What if I wasn't? Ash and something indefinably wrong, coating my tongue. I spat, but the taste lingered. Nadir, I asked, my voice tight, are there any atmospheric anomalies? Olfactory or gustatory? Negative, coal. All environmental parameters are stable and within nominal ranges. Then why do I taste ash? I muttered, wiping my mouth with the back of my hand. Perhaps stress, coal. You have been pushing yourself beyond recommended limits. Stress, I scoffed, but the word held little conviction. This was more than stress. This was a seed of unease, planted deep, beginning to sprout tendrils. My mind, usually a fortress of logic, felt permeable. As if the artifact's chaotic data wasn't just hitting the sensors, but was seeping directly into my perception, blurring the edges of my reality. The unique contact I yearned for was beginning, not as a dialogue, but as a subtle, insidious redefinition of my very senses. The dreams began as whispers, then grew into a roaring torrent of impossible geometries. My sleep, once a sanctuary of quiet darkness, became a landscape of shifting angles and non-Euclidean spaces. I saw structures that folded in on themselves, lines that were simultaneously parallel and intersecting, colors that defied the spectrum. It was a language without form, a narrative told the Nadir's console hummed with a sick, irregular rhythm. My hand, trembling faintly, hovered over the primary interface. The structural integrity readings, once steadfast green bars, now pulsed an anxious orange, then a sickly violet, as if the ship itself were breathing a poisoned air. The temperature, a moment ago, had been a comfortable 22 degrees Celsius. Now, a wave of heat washed over me, then receded, leaving a chill that sank into my bones, unrelated to any actual thermal shift. This was the artifact's touch, not on the ship's hull, but on my perception, on the very data streams meant to anchor me to reality. I had to find a pattern in the chaos. My fingers danced over the auxiliary comms array, bypassing the standard protocols, digging into the deeper, less used channels. The artifact didn't just absorb ambient data, it remixed it, folding time and space into its incomprehensible logic. Perhaps, within its convoluted influence, there lay echoes of previous encounters, fragments of other minds it had touched. A faint, almost imperceptible blip shimmered on a subfrequency I hadn't known existed. It wasn't a signal, not in the conventional sense, but a whisper in the data stream, a ghost in the machine. I isolated it, amplified it, watched as the raw feed coalesced into fractured text, then audio, then an unsettling blend of both. It was corrupted, yes, but not randomly. There was a deliberate, horrifying artistry to its distortion. The first voice was breathy, strained, overlaid with a crackling static that sounded less like interference and more like dry leaves scuttling across stone. Log entry. Date obscured. My designation is irrelevant now. We ascended the mountain pass. 3 days passed. The air thins, not from elevation, but from something taken. My breath hitched. A mountain pass? Here, in the void, aboard the Nadir? The voice continued, growing more disjointed. The stones. They don't hold their shape. The peaks. They shift like liquid glass. My companion. The cartographer. He keeps drawing maps that fold into themselves. His compass spins, endlessly, pointing to a sun that wasn't. The description, the disorientation, the warping of fundamental perception, it mirrored the anomalies I was experiencing on the Nadir. I fast-forwarded through stretches of maddening static and garbled cries, landing on another entry, a different voice, deeper, heavier, laced with a despair that felt ancient. Day. I have lost count. The mountain pass. It is no longer a path. It is a throat. And we are inside it. The provisions dwindle, but hunger is not the worst torment. They are stones, falling into my skull, arranging themselves into shapes that are not words, but meanings. A wet, rasping cough punctuated the statement. The others. The botanist. He began speaking in a language I did not recognize, yet understood perfectly. He spoke of colors that devoured light, of geometries that tore at the eye. Then he simply ceased. Not a body. Not a sound. Just absence. The horror was a slow-spreading frost. This wasn't unique to me. I wasn't the first, nor would I be the last. The artifact, or whatever it was a window to, had reached out before, across impossible distances and through unimaginable durations. It had found others, on some forgotten mountain pass, and subjected them to the same insidious unraveling. The audio was so degraded, so infused with the artifact's signature distortion, that it felt less like listening and more like tasting ash. The summit. There is no summit. Only an opening. A mouth. And the song. It is beautiful. My thoughts are no longer my own. I see the pattern now. We are merely notes. Transient vibrations. And soon the song will conclude. The transmission ended abruptly, dissolving into a high-pitched whine that resonated not in my ears, but directly behind my eyes, a pressure building in my skull. No final distress call, no desperate plea, no mention of death. They had simply become part of the song, absorbed, rewritten. My hands clenched into fists, knuckles white against the console's cool surface. The truly unique alien contact I had yearned for was this, a cosmic predator of perception, a devourer of sanity, echoing through time and manifesting its influence in disparate corners of existence. The mountain pass, the Nadir, they were merely stages. The artifact, a conductor. And I, Kolchen, was now just another instrument, playing my part in a terrifying, ancient chorus. The hum from the artifact outside intensified, a low, guttural thrum that vibrated through the deck plating, through my chair, through the very marrow of my bones. My isolation was absolute, cemented by the knowledge that countless others had walked this very path, had heard this very song, and had vanished into its incomprehensible harmony. It was not a silence, but an absence, a gaping void where the last moments of the transmission had been. I stood, or perhaps I swayed, in the Nadir's central chamber, the console lights a blur, their familiar glow now an alien luminescence. My fingers, numb and distant, still hovered over the controls, but the purpose for their movement had evaporated. I tried to recall the last few minutes, to piece together the sequence of events that led to this profound disorientation. The transmission. The cessation. The thing that had spoken, or sung, or simply been. A name, a face, a desperate plea, all gone. Only the echo of the whine remained, a pressure behind my skull that promised to return. I pushed off the console, my legs suddenly heavy, as if gravity had intensified its grip. The chamber, usually a sanctuary of sleek lines and functional design, seemed to stretch, its walls subtly warping at the edges of my vision. The floor beneath my boots felt uneven, no longer the stable deck plating I knew, but a rough, shifting terrain. It was the scent of damp earth and frost-bitten rock, a smell that had no place in the vacuum of space. I stumbled towards the viewport, needing the steadying sight of distant stars, the familiar tapestry of the cosmos. But the view was wrong. Utterly, terribly wrong. Instead of the velvet blackness studded with diamond points, a swirling, gray mist pressed against the glass, obscuring all but the nearest shapes. Below, a precipitous drop vanished into the churning vapor. I was not in the Nadir's observation deck, I was perched precariously on a sheer cliff face, the wind a silent scream against the hull. The mountain pass. I was in a mountain pass, but how? My heart, a frantic drum against my ribs, hammered a rhythm of disbelief. This was impossible. I was light years from any planet with such topography. I pressed my palm against the viewport, expecting cold glass. Learning. It was a single, resonant word, devoid of inflection, yet heavy with implication. It felt like a shard of ice embedded in my consciousness. I stumbled back, colliding with a storage locker. The impact jolted me, and for a fleeting moment, the mountain pass wavered, the sharp peaks blurring into the Nadir's internal structure. Then, with a sickening lurch, the illusion solidified once more, the crags and mist more vivid than before. The artifact. It was doing this. It was bending my reality, not just corrupting data, but constructing entirely new realities within my mind, perhaps even from my mind. I needed to check the artifact's containment field, to verify its status. I moved towards the engineering section, each step a battle against the perceived incline of the mountain path. My hands, when I reached the diagnostic panel, moved with a strange deliberation. I intended to initiate a full systems check, to find a logical explanation for this madness. But as my fingers hovered over the console, they hesitated. My own fingers, yet they moved with a will that was not my own. I watched, a horrified spectator in my own body, as they navigated through encrypted files, accessing data streams I had never consciously touched. They paused on a series of entries, marked only by glyphs I did not recognize, yet somehow, I understood their meaning. They were records. Records of my own thoughts, my fears, my deepest, most private memories. But they were not presented as I remembered them. They were twisted, fragmented, interspersed with alien patterns, like a mosaic of my soul reassembled by a malicious, indifferent hand. One entry, a vivid recollection of my childhood home, stood out. The scent of pine needles, the warmth of a hearth, the comforting presence of my grandmother. But within the memory, a new detail had been inserted, a small, obsidian shard, humming softly on the mantelpiece, its facets reflecting not firelight, but the swirling gray mist of the mountain pass. It had always been there, the memory insisted. Always. The artifact was not merely absorbing data, it was absorbing me. It was taking my memories, my identity, and weaving them into its own incomprehensible tapestry, learning the very fabric of my being, then reflecting it back to me, distorted and alien. The realization settled in my gut like a stone. I was not just observing the unraveling, I was the thread. A shudder ran through the perceived mountain pass, a deep rumble that vibrated through the floor. The mist outside the viewport thickened, pressing closer, and within its swirling depths, I thought I saw movement. Not the movement of wind, but of something vast, indistinct, shifting with a slow, deliberate rhythm. It was watching. It was waiting. And it knew me. It knew me better than I knew myself, now. My own mind had become a foreign country, colonized by an unseen entity, and the mountain pass, with its unforgiving peaks and bottomless chasms, was just the first landscape of its dominion. The metallic tang of fear was sharp on my tongue, a flavor I'd grown accustomed to. The thought, learning, still echoed, a frozen whisper in the hollows of my skull. My collision with the storage locker had been a desperate, instinctual recoil, a futile attempt to dislodge the intrusive shard. But it clung, an unwelcome tenant, rearranging the furniture of my mind. I found myself drawn to the mountain pass, an instinct I couldn't articulate, only obey. Perhaps it was the raw, exposed rock, the sheer, unyielding faces that scraped against the sky, that promised a kind of clarity. Here, the air was thin and sharp, biting at my exposed skin. Jagged peaks clawed at the bruised purple of the twilight, casting long, skeletal shadows that writhed across the desolate terrain. The wind, a mournful lament, scoured the ancient stones, carrying whispers that were not quite sound, not quite silence. It felt like the edge of the world, a place where the veil between what is and what shouldn't be was thinnest. The artifact rested on a makeshift plinth of stacked stones I'd assembled, its surface a dull, obsidian sheen under the fading light. The song, once a distant, discordant hum, now resonated with a terrifying intimacy, a melody woven from my own anxieties, my deepest, unvoiced fears. It was a siren call to unraveling, promising answers only through dissolution. My instruments, sophisticated as they were, had only ever skimmed the surface of its incomprehensible nature. The learning thought had been a key, a brutal insight. It wasn't about my understanding it, but about my becoming receptive to its understanding. The artifact wasn't a puzzle to be solved, it was a state of being to be entered. The wind whipped my hair across my face, stinging my eyes. The method, I realized, was not a physical interaction, not a button, not a sequence. It was a surrender. I had to unlearn the world, unlearn language, unlearn sanity itself. The artifact offered no reply, only the deepening hum, now a throbbing pulse against my eardrums. It wanted everything. To use as a conduit. I closed my eyes, the biting wind a physical presence on my face. I focused on the hum, letting it seep past my defenses, past the frantic protests of my rational mind. I pushed away the familiar, the comforting anchors of self. The mountain pass faded. The very concept of up or down became meaningless. There was only the hum, vast and omnipresent, and a sudden, terrible clarity. I was no longer Colchin. I was a vessel, a receptive membrane. And then, the revelation. The artifact wasn't a single object. It was a node, a resonating fragment of something infinitely larger, something that permeated the fabric of existence far beyond the Nadir's charted reaches. I perceived, not with my eyes, but with this newly opened, raw awareness, a network of similar nodes, scattered across impossible distances, each humming its own unique, terrible song. They were not connected by conventional space, but by a deeper, non-spatial web, a consciousness that was simultaneously singular and multitudinous. And I was now part of it. My mind, stripped bare, was flooded with a torrent of incomprehensible data. Not images, not sounds, but pure, unadulterated information that defied all human categories. It was the collective awareness of countless realities, countless perspectives, all converging, all learning. And through me, through my shattered perception, this network was now observing my reality, my fears, my desires. It wasn't a window, it was a mouth, and I had opened it. The horror was not in what I saw, but in what I became. The artifact's true nature wasn't a thing to be studied, it was a state to be endured. The mountain pass, the Nadir, my life, they were all just fleeting patterns in the immense, indifferent tapestry of its existence. And I was its newest thread. The thought, learning, had been a cold ember, but now it flared, scorching the inside of my mind. My head throbbed, a drumbeat against the skull's fragile bone, resonating with the artifact's deepening hum. The Nadir's familiar metallic scent of ozone and recycled air began to twist, morphing into something sharp, mineral, like whetstone after a lightning strike. The tremor in the deck plating beneath my boots intensified, not a mechanical vibration, but a resonant frequency that vibrated through my very marrow. It was as if the ship itself was straining, not against the vacuum of space, but against the fabric of reality. Then, the walls of the corridor began to ripple. Not a visual distortion, but a profound, physical undulation, as if the very atoms of the bulkheads were unmaking and remaking themselves. My hand, still pressed against the cold metal of the storage locker, felt the surface grow porous, then slick, then crumble into a fine, gritty dust that tasted of ancient earth. The controlled artificial light of the ship flickered, then died, replaced by a bruised twilight that seeped through impossible cracks in what had been solid steel. I was standing, or perhaps falling, on a treacherous incline. The air, thin and biting, clawed at my lungs. Before me, stretching into an impossibly vast, starless expanse, was a mountain pass. Its peaks were jagged, not carved by millennia of wind and ice, but twisted into forms that defied geometry, sharp angles folding back on themselves, casting shadows that moved independently of any light source. The rock faces shimmered with colors unseen by human eyes, hues of bruised amethyst bleeding into liquid ochre, all laced with veins of something that pulsed with a slow, internal luminescence. A sound began, not from a specific direction, but from everywhere at once. It wasn't just sound, it was a physical pressure that vibrated through my skull, making my teeth ache. Words, or the idea of words, formed within the cacophony, not spoken but implanted directly into my consciousness. They were not in any language I knew, yet I understood them with a primal, terrifying clarity. You sought contact. You found it. We are the space between the spaces. My throat was dry, constricted by the crushing weight of the impossible air. I squeezed my eyes shut, desperate to return to the sterile familiarity of the Nadir, to the rational, finite universe I understood. But the images intensified behind my eyelids, a swirling vortex of impossible colors, a cascade of abstract shapes that resolved, for a horrifying instant, into the fleeting impression of vast, indifferent eyes. When I opened them again, the mountain pass had shifted. And on the nearest cliff face, etched into the rock not by erosion but by some unthinkable force, were patterns. They were the same non-Euclidean symbols from the artifact, but here they lived, pulsed with that internal luminescence, shifting and reforming, each symbol a fragment of an incomprehensible language that spoke directly to the rawest nerve endings of my being. My mind reeled, trying to grasp, to categorize, to make sense. This wasn't a place one could map or measure. This wasn't just a glimpse, it was an invitation, a merging. My concept of self, of Kolchen, Xenolinguist, was dissolving like a sugar cube in boiling water. My memories, my identity, were no longer singular, but fragments swirling in this vast, alien consciousness. I saw my mother's face, then it was the face of 1,000 strangers, then it was a symbol, then it was nothing. Time became meaningless. A single breath stretched into an eternity collapsed into a single, terrifying thought. I am not coal. I am the echo of coal. I am the question. I am the answer. I am the mountain pass. I am the song. The determination that had driven me, the yearning for contact, twisted into a grotesque, irreversible understanding. There was no contact in the way I'd imagined. There was only absorption, transformation. My sanity didn't break, it simply ceased to be relevant. I was observed. I was no longer sane. I was simply aware. And the awareness was everything. The data slate pulsed with a flat, indifferent light, mocking the chaos within me. My fingers hovered, trembling not from fatigue, but from a tremor that resonated from deeper than bone, a vibration of dissolving logic. They refused the net of language. I stared at the blank screen, the familiar glyphs and characters of my xenolinguistic discipline now seeming arbitrary, fragile constructs. They were meant for finite things, for objects and actions bounded by space and time. But what I had seen, what I was becoming, existed outside those comfortable cages. It was a hunger, not of the stomach, but of the very fabric of meaning. It was a song sung by something vast and impossible, and its chorus was now the only sound in my skull. My mind reached for artifact, for structure, for message. Each word shattered before it could fully form, scattering into glittering shards of nonsense. The artifact wasn't a structure, it was a process. Not a message, but a transformation. It absorbed, yes, but it didn't merely store, it remade. It peeled back the skin of reality, revealing the raw, pulsing sinews beneath, and then it taught those sinews a new rhythm. A chill snaked up my spine, not from the Nadir's climate control, but from the sudden, alien cold of altitude. The console screen, moments ago displaying the blank canvas for my desperate words, rippled. A jagged, impossible peak, etched in shades of stark gray and glacial white, began to bloom across the monitor. It was the mountain pass, vast and silent, cutting the star charts into splintered angles. Its craggy ascent mocked the smooth lines of the Nadir's schematics, an alien geometry asserting itself over my familiar world. I felt the thin air burn my lungs, tasted the metallic tang of ice on my tongue, though I knew I was breathing the recycled air of my vessel. I tried to force my fingers to type. The object. It is not. It is. My internal voice faltered. How could I describe a thing that was not a thing, a mouth that consumed not matter, but perception itself? I attempted to articulate its effect. It unweaves. It makes. New. The words felt like pebbles in my mouth, too small, too smooth, inadequate. The sound that emerged was a rasp, choked and inhuman. The syllables felt wrong, like misaligned gears grinding. The concept of help itself seemed absurd, a relic from a language I no longer fully understood. What help could reach me here, across the impossible chasms that had opened within my own mind? I closed my eyes, seeking refuge, but the mountain pass persisted, etched on the inside of my eyelids, a silent, impassive sentinel. This was not a physical place, it was the landscape of my unraveling. The humming of the artifact, once a subtle thrum, was now a resonant vibration throughout my entire being. It was less a sound and more a state of existence, a constant reshaping. My own thoughts no longer felt entirely mine. They were echoes, refractions of the artifact's alien song, filtered through the tattered remnants of Colchin. I was becoming a conduit, a living antenna for frequencies that humans were never meant to perceive. I opened my eyes again. The data slate remained blank. The words were there, in my mind, but they twisted and contorted, refusing to align into human syntax. The universe. Round. It is. Sharp. Like the mountain, and it bleeds. Light. But the light is. My language, once my most trusted tool, had betrayed me, becoming a cage of broken glass, reflecting 1,000 fractured truths. My hand reached for the comms panel, a primal instinct to reach out, to connect. But what would I say? The stars are screaming, I thought. And I understand their song. The thought itself wasn't horrifying, it was simply true, in a way that bypassed the need for human emotion. And it was hungry for more. I needed to warn. The urgency was a spear point behind my eyes, yet it dulled, softened, becoming something akin to a whispered suggestion rather than a command. The ship's sterile, familiar hum seemed to thin, stretch taut, replaced by the faint, insistent whisper of wind through unseen crags. My vision blurred at the edges, the confines of the Nadir's observation deck melting into something vast and indifferent. The viewport, moments ago a canvas of distant nebulae, now presented a precipitous drop, a dizzying chasm carved into ancient rock. I was on a mountain pass. Its non-Euclidean geometry seemed to shift, impossibly, within my peripheral vision, edges folding into themselves, surfaces absorbing light in ways that defied physics. And I was listening. I picked up a shard, its edges keen, and brought it close. The cool surface pressed against my thumb, a grounding sensation in the unspooling world. The warning, the documentation, it all seemed so trivial now, so utterly pointless. What good were words against this absolute, devouring truth? I knelt, my knees protesting against the sharp stones of the mountain pass, yet I ignored the discomfort. my gaze fixed on the artifact, which seemed to swell and recede with each beat of my own erratic heart. I began to trace patterns on the dusty ground with the stone shard. Not symbols I knew, not xenolinguistic glyphs I had painstakingly catalogued. These were shapes that defied conventional geometry, loops that folded back on themselves, lines that intersected at impossible angles, forming polygons with too many sides or too few. Each stroke felt ancient, a forgotten language reawakening within the marrow of my bones. My fingers moved with an autonomy that was both terrifying and liberating. The fight was gone. The struggle, the frantic mental acrobatics to preserve my sanity, had ceased. It was a relief, a surrender as profound as it was absolute. The wind howled a forgotten name across the mountain pass, echoing the artifact's song. I was no longer Kolchen, the Xenolinguist, seeking contact. I was a vessel, a conduit for something that had no need for language, only for resonance. I laid the sharp stone down, then picked up another, smoother one, and then another, arranging them in a widening spiral around the pulsing artifact. They weren't just stones, they were fragments of memory, shattered pieces of my former self, being reordered into a new, incomprehensible mosaic. Each placement was precise, dictated by an instinct that was not my own, yet felt utterly correct. The air shimmered with an unseen energy, a palpable weight pressing down on the mountain pass. My voice, a rusty and used instrument, began to hum. It was a low, guttural sound, not a melody, but a series of elongated tones that vibrated in my chest, rising and falling with the artifact's silent thrum. The sounds were alien, yet familiar, as if I had always known them, had always been meant to utter them. This was the ritual. This was the acceptance. As I sang, or hummed, or chanted these nonsensical, resonant sounds, I felt a peculiar unraveling. It wasn't pain, not exactly. It was more like the careful unwinding of a tightly coiled spring, each strand of my identity loosening, detaching. My name, my past, my hopes, they drifted away like dust motes in the wind that swept across the mountain pass. What remained was a pure, unadulterated consciousness, attuned only to the artifact's song. I reached out, my trembling fingers closing around the artifact. Its surface was cool, smooth, yet subtly shifting beneath my touch, like solid water. There was no pain, no shock, only a profound sense of connection. The non-Euclidean patterns swam before my eyes, no longer terrifying but utterly logical, utterly beautiful. They were the language of this new reality, and I, Kolchen, was finally fluent. The world narrowed, collapsing into the artifact's impossible geometry, and I became part of its endless, silent song. The mountain pass dissolved into pure resonance, and I with it. Silent song pressing against my eardrums. I was losing my grip, not just on the data, but on the very concept of a stable, objective reality. The unique contact I had sought was not a dialogue, but a dissolution. My identity was not just being redefined, it was being unmade. The realization hit me with the force of a cosmic wave, shattering the last vestiges of my scientific detachment. The artifact was not merely an object, it was a focal point, a mouth perhaps, or a window, to something vast and ancient, something that existed utterly outside the comforting confines of conventional spacetime. It was not communicating with me in any way I understood, it was simply being asterisk, and its being was fundamentally incompatible with my own. The song it hummed, the one that resonated with my deepest fears and desires, was the sound of its existence, and it was unraveling me thread by thread. I stood before the monolith, my hands trembling, my mind a kaleidoscope of impossible geometries. The lab was no longer the sterile, familiar space I knew. The walls seemed to breathe, the floor to undulate, the very air thick with unseen presences. I saw impossible shapes in my peripheral vision I needed to document. I needed to warn. The urgency was a spear point behind my sternum, a desperate plea for clarity. But the artifact's hum, a low, resonant thrum that had become the very pulse of the Nadir, began to twist that urgency. It was a sculptor of dread, reshaping my intent, honing it into something far more intricate and terrible. The metallic tang of the ship's air grew sharper, a scent of ozone and something akin to damp earth after a long rain, a smell that had no place in the void. My own breath hitched, no longer mine alone, but a shared rhythm with the ship's deep, almost organic exhalation. The desire to warn did not vanish, it simply transmuted. It became a desire to share. Not a warning, no. A revelation. An invitation. My gaze drifted from the inert slate to the main console, its holographic displays shimmering with patterns that were no longer purely mathematical. They were glyphs, shifting constellations of light that spoke to a deeper, older grammar than any I had ever studied. The artifact, nestled in its containment field below the deck, was not merely present, it was acting. It was extending itself, not through conventional means, but through the very fabric of my perception, through the sinews of the Nadir itself. I moved, my steps precise, unhesitating. Each motion felt guided, not by an external force, but by an internal certainty that had bloomed from the core of my fear. The console controls, once familiar and sterile, now felt warm beneath my touch, responsive to the subtlest shift in my intent. My fingers danced across the interface, not selecting predefined protocols, but weaving new ones, improvising a language of transmission that was both alien and intimately known. The ship's core began a subtle vibration, a deep-seated shudder that resonated through the deck plates, up my legs, and into my chest. The hum of the artifact intensified, rising into a resonant chord that seemed to pluck at the very strings of my being. It was a song, without melody or rhythm, yet perfectly composed, perfectly compelling. It spoke of forgotten places, of edges where reality frayed, of a truth that devoured sanity and birthed a new kind of knowing. I watched the energy conduits glow, not with the steady blue of normal operation, but with a pulsating, sickly violet. The power surge wasn't a malfunction, it was an intentional act, a directed will. My will, or what remained of it, inextricably intertwined with the artifact's insidious influence. I was building a bridge, not of light or sound, but of pure, unadulterated pattern. Then, a flicker. A brief, searing image bloomed in the corner of my vision, not on any screen, but directly in the mind's eye. A narrow trail, winding like a scar across ancient stone. Above it, jagged peaks clawed at a bruised sky, their slopes dusted with stubborn, clinging snow. A mountain pass. The air, crisp and thin, carried the scent of pine and damp earth, a sensation so vivid it stung my nostrils. I saw small, hardy structures clinging to the rock face, faint lights winking in the twilight, hinting at lives lived in isolation. A place of raw, elemental beauty, utterly terrestrial, utterly vulnerable. That was where the signal would reach. That was a point of entry. Not the only one, perhaps, but a clear, startling target. The artifact was not merely broadcasting, it was seeking. It sought the quiet places, the minds open to subtle distortions, the cracks in the mundane world where its song could take root. A final, almost imperceptible surge coursed through the Nadir. A high-pitched whine, just beyond the threshold of human hearing, emanated from the ship's antennae. It wasn't a distress call, nor a greeting. It was an echoing, non-Euclidean lament, a lullaby designed to unravel, to corrupt, to invite. The warning had been sent, yes. But it was a warning that would remake its recipients in the image of its sender. The horror was no longer contained. It had found its voice, and through me, it had begun to sing. Eyes seemed too wide, too dark, reflecting not the lab lights, but an infinite, starless void. My features shifted, subtly, momentarily, taking on the angular, impossible lines of the mountain pass on the derelict moon, or the facets of the artifact itself. My identity, Kolchen, Xenolinguist, explorer of the unknown, was dissolving. I was no longer a solitary individual. I was a conduit, a focal point, a new mouth for the ancient, alien song. The yearning for unique contact had been fulfilled, but not in the way I had ever imagined. It was not a meeting of minds, but a complete absorption, a terrifying embrace. The artifact hummed, its song now a deafening roar within my skull, a chorus of impossible truths. I reached out, my hand no longer feeling entirely my own, and touched the dark, smooth surface. It was solid, yet my fingers seemed to pass through it, into something deeper, something beyond. I felt myself stretching, expanding, becoming one with the impossible geometries, the shifting dimensions, the vast, ancient presence that had finally found its voice. The Nadir was still a whisper in the void, but now, it carried a new, incomprehensible song, and I